Sound is the energy things make when they vibrate. Noise is the progression of multiple airborne collisions, molecules and molecules bumping into each other, an unrestrained game of Chinese whispers. Sound, rippling through the atmosphere, cruises at 1,220 kilometers per second, to eventually beach itself on the shore of your ear. Ether carries the sound out in all directions, which is why you can hear around corners. When sound is created, three things resonate: the object, the molecules in the medium, air or water, and the skin drum of your ear. Right now, you and I, and the air between us, are one. Frequency is simply the number of sound waves a thing makes in 1 second. The lowest hum of human audibility vibrates at 20 times a second. The highest hearable note quivers at 20,000 times per second. But there's a narrow bandwidth of super-sensitive hearing between 2,500 and 5,000 vibrations per second that our ears are tuned in especially to receiving. Gordon Hempton, a sound ecologist, once asked the obvious overlooked question: what is the ear listening out for when we aren't sensitive to all frequencies? The human voice vibrates at 85 to 255 times a second. So what is that narrow bandwidth of human hearing in the thousands for? It's for the birds.
Two birds perch on the branch of a tree. One consumes the hanging fruit, while the other observes. The one who is feeding is the body. The one watching is the soul. Hedonistic desires satisfied by the participant, witnessed by the other, who is metaphysically awakened. Bodily yearning versus spiritual liberation. Sitting in a tree. Kissing.
It's late afternoon in Venka's hospice room, but he's enveloped in the auditory blanket of my noise-cancelling earphones, listening. Brightness and warmth have been rewinded back beyond his range of vision, back to before the upper rim of the sun splintered the horizon this morning. Normally, I'd be sleeping right through this sun eclipse, nesting. But at Venka's request, I made the journey to MacRitchie because his legs won't carry him anymore to record the dawn chorus. I woke up before the sun did, although I know the sun never rises, we're just rotating around it. Circling for millions of years, the sun cascading over the surface of the planet, and with it, a never-ending wave of birdsong. The astronomical dawn of creation heralding the arrival of a single, unending note, oscillating before the human verse drowns out the bird's chorus. Speaking is vital for all animals' survival. We all exchange meaningful sounds to warn off predators and rivals. Humans evolved into language as a way of exchanging information, and our music's a sound-based system for communicating emotion. But what is the ear hearing when we aren't sensitive to all frequencies? Why did we evolve to hear birds singing over long distances? We come from a nomadic ancestry. If we really listen to the birds singing, what are we actually hearing? a fledgling community which has food and water, living in a habitat that has an extended season of prosperity, enough to raise their young and our own. The dawn chorus fills the tranquil air with testosterone. The male of the species, tired, hungry, wakes early to defend his breeding territory, phoning in the flock, trying to attract a mate. But when you make yourself visible to those you love, you also expose yourself to the possibility of being assaulted. Love and risk. Love and risk. The birds teach us that to attract a mate, you have to be vulnerable.
One of my wife's most treasured memories is one of my worst. Me at my most incompetent. To ease her suffering, I once asked Shruti if yelling into my armpit would help. The memory of this always brought her joy, and she brought it up to me again and again. On the bench under this tree where you were recording, she remembered it in the very early morning and echoed it back to me before her sudden return to India in the 3rd year of our marriage to look after her dying cousin. For you to understand the meaning of this underarmed, futile gesture of mourning, I have to start the story at my beginning. Junagadh, India, April. My first day going to a new school. The day was hot. Red flowers of the silk cotton tree carpeted the streets. Sitting next to the front door, my new school bag. On top of it, my pillow. I asked my mother why I needed one now and not before at nursery and kindergarten. She said the preparatory house would provide both bed and mattress. She had packed 2 sets of sheets and everything else I'd need. The school bag was full. The pillow didn't fit. She told me to the car I'd just have to carry it. It is said we are born twice, and both times I didn't ask for it. I'm told I arrived from my mother's womb kicking and screaming. And after 6 years on earth, it was time for my intellectual birth. From my childhood home, I would also be untimely ripped. My mother, she hadn't told me the whole truth. Half an actuality is actually a lie, not a fact. I would be going to a new school, Rajkumar College. Yes, but Rajkot was 100 kilometers away, and I wouldn't be coming back. Looking out the window of the car, all was silent. But what's 5 more hours added to a childhood of quiet? I was told to only speak when I was spoken to, but my mother and father only ever talked to each other. I was a mistake. Their love story only ever had scope for 2 characters, or so I thought. I was born too early, 9 years before my 2 brothers. I was always too much, too noisy as a child. My laugh too boisterous, my tears far worse. The needier I was, the less they paid me attention. Children should be seen and not heard. So I learned as a child to choose my words carefully. I would plan for hours, days, and when my bid for mother's attention was of no consequence, I would plan my next approach for weeks. But my mother was always annoyed with me. All this love I had to give was just dependency. And so, I trained myself to see it wasn't her. It was me. I was defective, faulty. I was just a child, a small, sensitive boy who didn't know how to fix his own unlovability. I didn't know how to keep my mother and father's interest. So with time, I learned to minimize the importance of relationships. I was educated by example. Love was not a celebration, it was just a familial obligation. I learned to shrink myself so I wouldn't be alone, so I would be clothed and fed, so I would have a home. It was a matter of survival, not living. And to do that, I had to marginalize my feelings. I was prepared to downgrade my needs to wants, and then again, from wants to niceties. I was taught to fear and loathe my very self. If I was deficient, I would have to become self-sufficient, to keep calm at all times, and never talk about difficult topics. I trained myself not to want to hold my mother's hand. As a 5-year-old boy, I forced myself to become a man. I survived that school, survived my childhood, my adolescence, without my parents, made playmates, kissed my first girlfriend, then broke up with her before she could leave me. 100 kilometers away from my parents, their lessons continued. I learned to fear intimacy, to equate it with rejection. But as someone once said, to fear love is to fear life, and those who fear life are already 3 parts dead. So I spent time practicing what they now called self-soothing. But when most of your time is spent disassociating, it's hard to tell whether you're doing things because you find them pleasurable or if it's reality you're really escaping. Returning from boarding school at 18, I found my room had been filled by my brothers. I was now homeless, so I continued my education across an ocean, safely distanced. My parents put up no resistance, said there was no need to visit, just to wire transfer the money. After years of silence and self-parenting, I got a call in the middle of the night, which can only mean 2 things. Someone has been born or someone is dying. Son, your father is declining, and it's time you got married. And so it was arranged by mother. I'd known about Shruti. She was my age. My mother thought we'd be a perfect match, a spinster with a bachelor. Shruti had helped my mother bear the weight of my father, who was Shruti's dead mother's distant cousin through marriage. My wedding was followed soon after by my father's funeral. From death, we returned from Junagadh and arrived in Singapore, both tired at midnight. There would be no honeymoon. We entered my flat, right feet first, and Shruti took out her idols from a carry-on luggage, set them by the window in an east-facing direction. And with this, I became aware of my first failure as an unqualified husband. No area had been made for her and her things in my apartment, except the space beside me in bed, where she laid weeping. You can close your eyes at night, but you cannot close your ears. Both of us fully clothed, pretending to be sleeping. I breathing, her weeping at 30 hertz per second. It made me uncomfortable. But I had made a wedding vow to look after her and her pleasure. I had sought out the expertise. I had learned the lessons that now had to be put into practice. But none of my education had prepared me for sobbing. 2 violins in a room speak to each other. If you play a note on one violin, the unplayed one also sings. The vibration of her crying started dislodging something, and a string in my mind, long forgotten, started resonating. I thought back through my years, trying to remember what a man should say to someone crying in close proximity, and I remembered my dead father. My father and I, sitting on the boarding school bed on my first day at Rajkumar College, waiting for the return of my mother. I had tried to hold back the tears, but when your whole body is riddled with them, some will be spilt. Your mother and your school administrator will be back soon with your bag and your pillow. At night, you can cry into it, so you don't wake the other boys. It will stop the sound from spreading. But for now, said my father, you can scream into my armpit. I wrapped my arms around his waist, and under his arm buried my face, my chin on his ribs. I gave in and howled. The smell of his sweat, the laundry detergent of his undershirt, the shock and the pain and the pleasure of it, of wailing into my father's underarm, filled my snotty nose long after my parents' departure. You can cry into my armpit. My new wife giggled in the darkness and said no to the offer, but thank you. Said maybe another time and rolled over. I listened to the twitter of her half-suppressed laughter echo in the darkness, turning from disaster into snores. I thanked my dead father for being a human and for letting me be a child. And my mother, I thanked her after. I put my endurance for hours of planning my next affectionate action to good use in my marriage. In many Hindu literary works, kings implore in long poetical poems the birds of the dawn chorus to scour the earth for a trace of their lost wives. Love and risk, love and risk. To attract a mate, you have to be vulnerable.